It's March 2022. Russia has invaded Ukraine, and the Western countries, the European Union, Great Britain, Canada, America, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, all of them have imposed sweeping sanctions on Russia, the likes of which the world has never seen before. In an effort to limit Russia's war-making abilities and to make Russia return to the negotiating table and pull out of its armed invasion of Ukraine. But not a few weeks had passed since these sanctions have been imposed, then people have been starting to wonder just how effective will these sanctions be? Just how necessary are these sanctions? And what even are sanctions anyways? And now, in September 2023, when the war has been going on for more than a year, more than 1.5 years, those doubts about economic sanctions are growing ever stronger. So, that is what we're going to talk about today. Everything you need to know about economic sanctions. Welcome back to Streamlined Insights, the most international and scientific measure of the world. I'm Streamlined Engine. Now, to first understand economic sanctions, we need to know what it is and the idea behind this. So, if we just want a one-sentence definition of economic sanctions, it's one country imposing legislative measures to limit the business ability and the trading abilities of another country. What is more complicated than the definition of it is the idea behind it. So, after World War II, the international system set up in Bretton Woods and set up in the Atlantic Charter and the United Nations is one that is built to enhance and to promote international trade. The idea behind it is that with increased trade relations, countries will focus upon accumulating wealth and would not go to war with each other so often. So, enhancing trade is a way to accumulate wealth for each country and to preserve peace as well. So that is why economic sanctions matter, because under this kind of international system, whenever someone imposes economic sanctions on another country, it literally means that they are being shut off from participating naturally in the international system. So, when they are shut off from interacting normally with the international system, the idea is that the price of it would be so great, would be so too much to bear, that the party being imposed sanctions upon would refrain from using military action, will refrain from using aggressive force to pursue whatever goals they want to pursue, and would instead return to a peaceful manner and will do things through trade and through dialogue. So now you understand the reasoning behind economic sanctions, we can now talk about the specifics of what economic sanctions are. Now, to talk about this, it'll be good to remember the 4 core means of productions, the means of productions that Marxists are intent upon seizing. We're not talking about seizing the means of production here, but we're talking about the means themselves. The 4 means: labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. These 4 are those means that when the country wants to encourage business, they will work upon. And when the country wants to limit the business capabilities of anyone else, they will work upon these as well. We'll talk about land first, because land is more of a collective term to talk about resources and talk about firm and viewable assets. So, in the case of Russia versus the West, when the West had imposed a sweeping set of sanctions on Russia, the sanctions on land means that Russia can no longer directly invest in land or in any property in Western countries. And of course, Russia has slapped back sanctions on the West, so the West cannot invest directly in land or in any resources in Russia anymore. That's called FDI, by the way, foreign direct investment. So FDI and FPI, foreign portfolio investment, has almost completely stopped between Russia and the West. And then there is labor. Labor and entrepreneurship is more talking about the human side of things, whether it be human labor or human wisdom, human experience, human craftsmanship that is essential in doing business. Well, travel bans between experts, technical experts, business experts, and even just tourists and workers between Russia and the West, travel bans, I say, that means limiting the issuing of visas, has meant that human interaction, like Russian experts traveling to the West to work in Western companies or Russian companies or vice versa, has almost completely stopped too after Russia has invaded Ukraine and the West has imposed sanctions and Russia has imposed sanctions back. And then there are the limitations on capital. You must have heard about this. Like after Russia invaded, Russia was immediately excluded from SWIFT, the international banking system. Excluding it from the banking system means that Russian assets overseas are already frozen. When we say Russian assets, it means that assets that are owned by Russian government, Russian central bank, Russian people, Russian business, all of them are called Russian entities. The assets they own sometimes means foreign cash, whether it be pound sterling or in US dollars, or it might be in firm products like houses or land or anything like that. Assets owned by these Russian entities, they are now frozen in the West. They cannot be accessed by these Russian entities to be turned back into money anymore. No, that cannot be done. Not only that, these entities cannot access foreign cash directly anymore, meaning they can't loan US dollars or pound sterlings for them to do business in Russia or really anywhere else. And being denied from SWIFT means that you are being denied a very convenient platform of international transaction. Just think about using EasyCard or credit card to take the MRT, to rent a bike, or to just buy a drink from 7-Eleven. And then think about when you are being punished, then you can't do that anymore. That is the idea behind excluding Russia from SWIFT. Okay, and the final part of that is the direct control of exports and imports. The West has controlled exports to Russia, meaning that high technology, those kinds of semiconductor and chips that can benefit war items such as missiles and tomahawks, those cannot be exported to Russia anymore. And other technologies such as making chemicals, making bioweapons, anything like that, no, not those either. And about import control is more denying the revenue that Russia can make from selling their things. And the main thing that Russia sells, as anyone knows, is natural gas and oil. So the Western Alliance has stopped importing any oil and any gas, virtually any oil and gas, the moment that Russia invaded Ukraine. And the idea behind that was to deny the Kremlin a key source of revenue. So they won't be able to finance the war anymore, and they might not even be able to finance their government or even pay out pensions or other basic governmental services. The idea was that. So now you understand that all of these things are included in economic sanctions. And in sanctions beforehand, such as the US's sanctions on Iran or Iraq, on Afghanistan, or any South American countries, Venezuela, or in any African countries, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, all sorts. Sanctions can include some, or in Russia's case, all of those things. But now we've established what sanctions is all about, we can start answering the question. How effective are sanctions? And just how necessary are these sanctions? You have to establish a measurement, an index to measure to measure just how good sanctions are working, just like when you want to measure anything else. So normally, the measure that one takes when considering how good sanctions are working is, has sanctions deterred a party from using military force or aggressive force? If a military force or aggressive force is already used, has economic sanction, in fact, dissuaded that party from using that force any further or withdrawing their aggressive force? Or has these sanctions prevented like a boomerang effect from hurting those parties that are imposing the sanctions themselves? And how necessary these sanctions are, the measurement is a little different. We'll talk about that later. We'll answer these first few questions first. Well, The answer to how will sanctions work is really 50-50. Because there are some cases that sanctions did indeed prevent a party from using aggressive force. For example, in the football war, when El Salvador and Nicaragua went to war with each other, the threat of sanctions by the South American entity upon using forces any further by either of those parties prevented the war from escalating further. And then in the Gulf War, when Iraq forcibly annexed Kuwait, the threat of sanctions, the already imposed sanctions by America, had dissuaded Saddam Hussein from continuing the war in Kuwait any longer. Well, of course, there was a military action in that war as well, but sanctions certainly did play a certain important part. You ask Hussein himself in his diaries and he will tell you that. But then again, there are those instances when sanctions are not working so well. For example, the US has placed North Korea under sanctions for decades, but North Korea has barely budged. It certainly has not democratized, and it certainly has not stopped shooting missiles into the Sea of Japan and as far as Guam. And the sanction against Russia, these current sanctions that are being imposed, the effects they're having on the Russian economy is not what people are expected either. And you might ask that, well, why is that? Sanctions are such a broad range that export, imports are all controlled. The interaction between human capital is limited, and capital raising cannot be done either. So why would sanctions not work? Well, the answer to that is how integrated an economy is in the international system. For example, if Russia, who is already preparing for war since 2014 up to 2022, it's true, Russia has been preparing for war for at least 8 years after they annexed the Crimea. If an economy is more self-reliant and not as dependent on international trade, I say, then the effects of sanctions, of course, will be limited. And in the case of North Korea, the problem of that is that it was never integrated in the international system anyways, so sanctions might not work so well in deterring North Korean actions. And then another argument that we often hear about sanctions is the boomerang effect, that a country that is imposing sanctions will actually hurt itself or its partners much more than the party that they are trying to impose sanctions on, that they are trying to punish. The most prominent example of that will be Germany, who imports 55% of natural gas and 35% of all oil from Russia, and therefore imposing sanctions on Russia actually hurt its own economy, its own people, much more than anything. Well, these boomerang effects certainly do happen, but they are a bit more few and far between. For example, the United States had never experienced such reprisals by imposing sanctions on anyone. Very rarely so. So that is why Germany is starting to feel the effects of being over-reliant on authoritarian countries that we discussed one episode earlier. And then another argument about not imposing sanctions is the one about affecting the civilian population of the party that you are punishing much more than the regime you are punishing. Well, that is a lot trickier to avoid, to navigate around. Because when you are imposing sanctions on an authoritarian country, in particular, of course, the wealthy class, the ruling class, will have more ways to navigate around those sanctions because they already have a lot of wealth in their pockets and already monopolize most of the means of production in their country. So the lack of foreign capital, the lack of foreign expertise, and the lack of just imported goods from another country, of course, that'll hurt the civilian population a lot more. So you would think that, for example, if you want to hurt Saddam Hussein more than you want to hurt the Iraqi people, or you want to hurt Vladimir Putin much more than you want to hurt the Russian people, then sanctions obviously is not the way to go. Well, the fact of the matter, and this isn't anything pretty, this is just the fact of the matter, is that sanctions has to be done. Because for all its adverse effects, in an international system where it is anarchical, where states really cannot do much to influence, to limit, or really to rein in the actions of another state, economic sanctions is just about the only thing that countries can do to influence one another. Think of it as in a friend group, like individuals or we individuals interacting. Like when you want to punish a friend, what exactly can you do? Like excluding the scenario where you actually get to a physical fight. In that case, where bodily features like height and weight probably matters. Excluding that kind of scenario, if you don't want to resort to violence or to breaking the law, what exactly can you do to a friend that is making you upset or that is behaving in a way that you probably don't approve of? It's really very limited. You can ignore their messages, you cannot invite them on your night outs, but that's just about it, because you are on an equal footing. Well, that's pretty much the same situation in the international arena as well. One state, even one as powerful as the United States, cannot really rein in the actions of another country unless they resort to force, which of course is something that nobody wants to see. So if you don't resort to force and you don't want to you don't want to do nothing either, because obviously you really can't do nothing if you want to uphold certain values like peace in the international arena, like democracy and human rights and the rule of law. If you do want to become a situation where you do nothing and you don't want to resort to military force either, propaganda war and economic warfare is pretty much the only thing that you can do. So, in order to retain your own reputation, and in order to set up an example that it is not okay to just disrupt the international system any way you please, and to do it in a civilized way and not resorting to force, because that would be descending to the level of the challenger, of the breaker of the international rules. If you want to do it in a civilized way, I say, economic sanctions is just about the only thing that you can do. So, for all its adverse effects, this is what countries are going with at the moment. And from a business point of view, sanctions certainly do hurt. I mean, for all of those times where you hear that sanctions don't work and sanctions are unnecessary, sanctions are ineffective, all that is mostly done by people who, excuse me for saying so, but do not really possess an understanding of the business arena. Because think about it, just for the semiconductors industry, it really matters if exports and imports are controlled. It really matters if capitals cannot be raised. And it really, really matters if human expertise cannot be traded between countries. So, in the case of Russia, they don't make that much semiconductors anyway, so it doesn't affect this particular industry. But in the future, if sanctions were to be imposed on any other countries, then the semiconductor industry will hurt. And as we've already established, if the semiconductor industry hurts, then the whole world is going to hurt as well. The only way around not placing economic sanctions, the dilemma of economic sanctions, is when every party in the world agrees that resorting to violence is a no-go. That violence is off the table if you want to resolve any problems. But before that, economic sanctions, as bad as they are, as indirect as they are, and as frustrating as they are, is the only way forward. We talked a lot about sanctions in this episode. That's the whole episode anyways. And from sanctions, you can understand that the relationship between politics and economy is always a complicated one that really can't be separated as far as people want to. So, the next episode, we are going to talk about a very specific example of how these two cannot be separated and how mismanaging one will lead to huge and catastrophic effects on the other. I am Streamlined Engine, and you have been listening to Streamlined Insights.